I feel like Henry V before Agincourt. We band of brothers and sisters. We may be at the foot of Mount Olympus, but it makes the summit all the more glorious. 2,000 years ago, the proudest boast in the civilized world was civis Romanus sum. I am a Roman. 200 years ago, in the world of liberty, the proudest boast was, I am an American. Now, we have lost that mantle with Ron Paul in the White House. It can be restored. The luster of the Republic can be regained. And I want to utilize my time in speaking to you to explain how close we are to the precipice of ruination and how we all are duty-bound as members still of a dwindling republic to participate in recapturing liberty for ourselves and our posterity. Now let me pose a hypothetical to you which I think will jar you into recognizing the peril that we confront. The President of the United States, tonight, tomorrow night, commands prime time and announces to all the American people, I've got secret intelligence that imminently we will suffer another attempted attack far worse than 9/11. I've got it on very reliable sources. I need to make you safe, so I am announcing the temporary suspension of the Constitution. Congress is dissolved, the Supreme Court is dissolved, but I will restore our dispensation as soon as possible, but I need to make you safe. And I can guarantee you my secret sources are infallible, the same ones that enabled me to kill Osama bin Laden. Now, with the president making such a statement, how many people in this room believe the American people would be out on the sidewalks and in the streets within moments, protesting, demanding the president be impeached and removed for office for high crimes and misdemeanors, something the Founding Fathers described as attempts to subvert the Constitution? Would the Congress of the United States begin to hold hearings and protest? Or do you think it's more likely they'd say, wow, we might write you a letter that seems rather audacious, but we've already yielded the war power, the power to spend, the power to tax, and everything else. So maybe it isn't so far from suspending the Constitution de jure, since de facto we have waited out all of the separation of powers that were enshrined by the Founding Fathers. But in my judgment, we have something close to another 9/11, a president of the United States. If it's not the incumbent, it's a matter of time until we get a Caligula in office. It's just numbers. Caligula will suspend the Constitution of the United States. We think, no, that couldn't happen here. Yeah, it could happen right here. How many of you in this room could believe the President of the United States, started with Bush, even after Watergate and Obama, claims authority to place an American citizen on an assassination list and kill him with no due process if the President unilaterally decides, with the confidence that we knew there are weapons of mass destruction in Iraq? He's a danger, an imminent danger. We can't take any chances, and I never get it wrong. This is 2011. Gee, I knew that Vladimir Putin placed Russian citizens on assassinations. This is the United States of America. These are chapters we are living with now that I remember reading about in Alexander Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago. The deceit, the lies that get us into war that are routine. That's just one example, in my judgment, of a hypothetical that's not far-fetched. But let me kind of recount the earmarks, I think, of empire, of destruction of the Constitution that will not enable a republic and liberty to survive. The most important usurpation, from our perspective, is the authority to commence war. The Founding Fathers devoted an enormous portion of the Constitutional Convention, the Federalist Papers, to discussing why they were architecting a diffusion of power to ensure, in their words, that no one man, no group of men could take us from a state of peace to a state of war. I want to just pause for a moment to explain why that decision is like crossing the Rubicon. It's because when you're at war, it makes what's customarily murder legal. I want to repeat that. In wartime, what's customarily murder is legal. So it's not something that you do lightly. Not only that, ever since Cicero spoke over 2,000 years ago, in times of war, the law is silent. Most of you would remember World War II, 120,000 Japanese Americans incarcerated in concentration camps, upheld by the U.S. Supreme Court. Although the court said racism is odious to a free people, they then sanctioned racism of the rawest sort. These concentration camps were created 6 months after Pearl Harbor, when there had not been a crumb of evidence that a single Japanese American committed espionage, sabotage, or was disloyal. And it was based upon an affidavit of a general, his name John DeWitt, who surveyed all of the West Coast and came to the conclusion that the fact that there had been no acts of treason, no acts of sabotage, was a confirming indication that it was afoot and would soon occur. This was a page out of Alice in Wonderland that helped convince the U.S. Supreme Court to uphold that. But I'm saying this is an example. In times of war, the law is silent. That's why war is so critical to the Founding Fathers' entrustment of that responsibility only to Congress. And they explained, and this wasn't any kind of aberration, all of the Founding Fathers, from those who wished to have a weaker executive to those like Hamilton who wanted a very muscular executive, said, we can never give the authority to go to war to the president because he has a temptation to concoct excuses, since wartime means what? More power to the president. The secrecy, the taxes, the contracts, the appointments, the fame, the footprints, and the sands of time. Indeed, when they had surveyed the entire history of the world, from biblical times onward, they could see a universal pattern. It was the executive branch that virtually always initiated war. It wasn't limited to particular times and places. And when they examined Europe, which was their most recent experience, yes, it was kings and queens concocting excuses to go to war, to expand their power and authority. So we have Article 1, Section 8, Clause 11 of the Constitution. Explicit as can be. Only Congress has the authority to declare war. And at the Constitutional Convention, when there was discussion about that particular language, because at one time the draft stated only Congress can make war, there was an exchange between James Madison and George Mason, said, no, the president does need authority to respond to an actual attack, to save the country when there's immediate need for a response. But absent an actual attack, only Congress has the authority to get us into war. Universally understood. And that was said to be the crown jewel of the Constitution. This is what will save us from ruination and from despotism. The president can't take us into war. George Washington, he presided over the Constitutional Convention. And one of the first things he said as president was what? Only Congress can authorize the initiation of offensive warfare. That was Washington. We had Thomas Jefferson. Just to fight the Barbary pirates, which wasn't technically war, he had 10 statutes authorized him to use our Navy against the Barbary pirates. James Madison, he's the father of the Constitution, the one who was most wary of presidential war making. When he was president, he needed a declaration of war from Congress to fight the British over impressment of U.S. seamen and failure to recognize neutral ships and neutral goods in times of war. So all of them understood and acted on that principle. And where are we today? Where are we today? The Constitution has been turned on its head. The current president of the United States staked out a position over Libya. I don't need congressional authority to initiate war. In fact, his Office of Legal Counsel issued what you might call a white paper. Looked to me more like it was out of the Ministry of Truth in George Orwell's 1984. It doesn't cite any language of the Constitution, but in practice they conclude the president can go to war in the name of regional stability, the credibility of the UN Security Council or General Assembly. Now, can you imagine that? Or any other reason that he believes is in the national interest. In other words, the president can go to war at whim. The most extraordinary announcement of a usurpation in the history of the presidency. It's true Harry Truman fought the Korean War because he called it a police action, and he never received congressional authority. But he didn't announce a precedent that every war he would call a police action and could utilize the armed forces without any authority from Congress whatsoever. Without any authority from Congress whatsoever. And if we're looking at history, you may recall after World War I, there was an attempt to have the United States get involved with the League of Nations and ratify the Versailles Treaty. And we rejected the League precisely because then President Woodrow Wilson insisted on a clause that enabled the president to go to war unilaterally without congressional authority to uphold League of Nations mandates. So there's a reaffirmation. Only congressional prerogative obtains to moving from a state of peace to a state of war. And now we have a president who blatantly announces that that now is a museum piece. He, like Nancy Pelosi, remember she took or whited out an impeachment clause from the Constitution right after she became Speaker. And now we have the war clause whited out as well. And then there's flirtation with whiting out the spending clause. You know, the president was going to borrow money that hadn't been authorized by Congress to pay the debts, and then he could raise taxes unilaterally. That's probably a few months away. But it will come. And then what, however, has been the response to the people of the United States by the people and the Congress? Nothing. Complacency. Well, Libya's a country, faraway country. We really don't know much about it. It's a volunteer army. We're not fighting. So who cares? Even though the principle, the precedent set, is like a dagger at the heart of the Constitution, because it means we are at the beck and call of the president when it comes to going to war. And when war comes, I tell you, there's not any civil liberties. There's not any law whatsoever. Might makes right, even in the United States, to the extent we have an independent judiciary. Now, Congress holds a few hearings on the issue of whether the president was acting lawfully in Libya. But they don't do anything. The best the House of Representatives could muster was a bill that said, Mr. President, you have flouted the Constitution. You have violated the War Powers Resolution. And we're going to write you a letter. And you should explain what you did. Now, I had drafted an article of impeachment. You can read it in Politico, that went through chapter and verse of the War Powers Clause from beginning till today, and explaining why a high crime and misdemeanor covers attempts to subvert the Constitution by usurping the power of one branch. Nothing. There are a few allusions to it on the floor of Congress, but that's what the best they could muster for usurping the most important power in all of Article 1. Oh, write us a letter. Of course, the president decided he really wasn't going to write a letter anyway. Not only was that an act of unbelievable arrogance by the president, on the Senate, there was a hearing discussing what was the definition of hostilities within the meaning of the War Powers Resolution, because if you're engaged in hostilities in the War Powers Resolution, you have to come to Congress within 60 days and get them to authorize any extension. Subject to 30 days, the president has to remove troops from a situation of imminent hostilities.